I'm going, Andrew, thank you once again for leading off. And this is our last topic on holistic design. Holistic design. The screen is yours.
All right. Well, I'm going to start with something that doesn't directly have to do with architecture, but I think you'll see the point of me bringing this up fairly soon. These are two pictures from Ecuador in South America, and you can see that they represent two different ecologies, two different environmental systems. One of them on the coast that's sort of like a tropical environment, and then one at a volcano that's further inland in Ecuador, up high in the mountains. And in the late early 1800s, there was a German scientist with the name Alexander von Humboldt who traveled to Ecuador and was interested in studying nature in a new way. Instead of focusing on the individual species, he was really interested in the integrated systems of all of these species. And so he noticed that in Ecuador, when you went to the coast, you had a certain kind of integrated system of all kinds of different plants and animal life, and that it was a very different kind of integrated system up by the volcano. And it was actually thanks to Alexander von Humboldt that we understand now the impact of altitude on biodiversity and plant life. And he was really just fascinated with learning about how all of these different species were interrelated with each other and interdependent of each other, and how they formed a whole that can be defined and can be described as a sort of set of relationships. And so he's actually the person that we usually credit with the sort of description of the concept of ecology, the sort of introduction of that sort of way of thinking about studying nature. And the word ecology is really an interesting word. It comes from the Greek and is a combination of the word house and to study. So it's the study of the house. And that's a really interesting meaning right there, because it tells you right there that when you're studying ecology, you're studying something that at some point people felt it appropriate to make it analogous to the study of a building. And you know, that right there is a clue that design is involved. And so we're going to be looking at ecology and some of the sort of things that Alexander von Humboldt studied. And this is a drawing that was done of his studies in the 1860, I believe, is when this drawing was prepared after his studies had been published in the early 1800s. So he did not produce this drawing, but the drawing is based on his studies. And this particular drawing is, from what we know, the first illustration of an ecological transect. And for me to explain to you what an ecological transect is, it's basically a way of describing how different ecologies exist adjacent to each other. And so this drawing actually shows a section that's cut through the entire South American continent at the equator at Ecuador. And in the notes that you see on the left and on the right are all these different observations about species and biodiversity that Alexander von Humboldt made during his travels to Ecuador and to South America. And obviously the section is wildly exaggerated in terms of its vertical height, but it's not really supposed to be an accurate representation of the dimensions of the continent, but more a summary of the ecological diversity and the different habitats and systems that exist on the continent at this location. And what's really cool about the drawing and the notes is that as you go up vertically, it describes to you the different plant species that exist that he found at a higher elevation in the Andes. And then as you go lower, you find the ones that he found at a lower altitude, in the rainforest and the different sort of locations along the coast and so on. So this is in French because his work was originally published in French, but he referred to it in German as a landscape or a nature painting. And I think here in French, tableau physique is like a physical painting of the Andes and his adjacent countries, is what it says here. And really what this drawing is it's an attempt to summarize his understanding of the wholeness of nature, that all of these different species that exist in South America and in Ecuador in particular around this volcano, that they all exist within certain logical locations and are dependent and interdependent on each other within these different altitude locations and within these different ecologies. And so it's like a summary of how these ecologies exist relative to each other and how the different elements of each ecology find a home within particular habitats. So this way of thinking later on became a very important discovery because it informed our understanding of how different ecological systems function and how species relate to these different ecologies. And so one of the things about this way of thinking is that it introduces you to this notion of holistic systems. And this is a coastal transect, in the Bahamas. And what you see here is these sort of different, what you might call transect zones. So each of these different sort of rectangular areas is a distinct ecology. So you can see here there's the Atlantic Ocean ecology, which is distinct from the intertidal beach, which is distinct from the dune ridge and the palmetto grove and the oak canopy forest and the mangrove swamp and the intercoastal waterways. And so each of these different areas is a complete system in and of itself, but they also all rely on their neighboring systems in order to support certain species. So let's just kind of walk through this just for a second. Like certain crabs can walk all the way from the ocean all the way through this dunescape, but certain plants can only exist in certain locations. If these plants that are growing on the dune ridge, they can't live further down in the intertidal beach because they'll just get destroyed by the wave action and everything down here. And similarly, the kinds of species that can thrive in the mangrove swamp can't live at the intertidal beach because of the differences in water and species that are around there. And so, I'm not a biologist and this is not my specialty, but I think everybody can understand that you have these different habitats that exist that can be understood and that there's an order to nature that can be described. And this is fundamentally what Alexander von Humboldt was interested in. And it introduced us to this notion of holistic systems that are made analogous to the concept of a house, of an artifact like a house, an environment. And so the word holistic, it relates to or is concerned with wholes or with complete systems rather than with the analysis of treatment of or dissection into parts. And so when you're talking about holistic things, you're talking about the big picture and about the set of relationships that are being described, rather than the individual components. The individual components are always referred to in terms of their relationship to the whole when you're talking about holistic issues. And so that might be one of the reasons that when Romans 8:22 says we know that the whole creation has been groaning, as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time, it makes sense when you think of creation as a holistic system. Because as soon as you have a holistic system where all of the individual parts are integrated and interdependent of each other, once you have something like sin that is introduced, it infects not just the one tree or the one person or the one family, but it affects the entire system because everything is interconnected. And so when you go to the Genesis account and you read through the 6 days of creation, you're really reading about a creation of systems, about a creation of holistic environments that God then places human beings into, and they then become part of that system. And so, and in the whole sort of, this narrative of God educating Adam and Eve in the garden is about an education of how they are part of a holistic ecology, in a sense. And so that is really what they were pursuing, is ecology, is the study of homes, of a house, which is the house that God built in these 6 first days. And so this is one way of sort of understanding how that creation narrative is really intended to function, and why it's important to understand that relative to sin. And so from an architectural standpoint, yes, ecology refers to the study of a house, but there is actually a way of understanding urban habitat or human-made, man-made habitats in a way that's analogous to the ecological transect. And there's this way of thinking about that is referred to as the rural to urban transect, which is an urban design theory and practice that is very prominently practiced nowadays in leading urban design circles. And it really is a way of thinking about how the individual elements of the human habitat correspond to the whole of the human habitat. And so here's an example. The transect is not an invention, it's a discovery. Similar to the ecological transect as a discovery of natural systems, the rural to urban transect is a discovery of how urban systems interrelate and urban elements relate to these systems. And so, for example, this is a panoramic photo in the middle that was taken from the top of a tall building in Nassau in the Bahamas. Obviously a historic photo. And you can see when you take that panoramic picture and look at it very carefully, you're actually looking at different kinds of urban environments from left to right. You can see that there's this thing that you might call the urban center over here. You might call that the downtown or the core of the urban city of Nassau. And then if you look a little further to the right, you can see that the urban environment really changes pretty significantly. Suddenly you have gaps between buildings, you have more gardens, and the buildings change a little bit. You start seeing more porches and different kinds of shapes happening here in this general urban neighborhood. And then when you pan even further to the right, you get into this sort of quasi-suburban environment where there's now larger lots with really different kinds of building types. And so even though it's one city, there's also sort of different ecologies within each of these areas within the city. And if you sort of look down at the bottom photos of these buildings, historical buildings in Nassau, you can see that the building types really change. You know, you have buildings that are right up to the property line with, porches and balconies hanging over, with mixed use conditions and very dense urban conditions. And then when you get to this general urban condition, you can see it sort of loosens up a little bit. You end up with side yards and walled gardens and bigger porches with larger areas for cross ventilation and more of a residential feel to it. And then when you get to the suburban area, suddenly the buildings are set back and you have much larger gardens and even more porches and opportunity for residential cooling systems for people, keeping people cool in that climate and environment. And you can see that even the way that people painted these environments sort of reflects these different kinds of ecologies. And so there's a way of understanding how individual design features of buildings are part of a larger system and not just isolated events. So the porch on this building is part of a context that can be described in the form of a transect. And you can go to different places around the world. This is an example in Williamsburg, Virginia. And you can study how individual elements fit into this rural to urban transect. So this is a study of fences in Williamsburg. And these fences are all part of a larger system. So, for example, the fence here that's at the top in the middle is a rural fence. This is a type of fence that makes a lot of sense at the most rural part of the spectrum. That's what this T1 refers to. It's the transect zone 1, the most rural. And when you go all the way to the other end of the spectrum at the bottom right, you can see now you're dealing with a brick wall with a stone cap and wrought iron fence detailing on the top. And that's a very urban fence. And that is at the sort of T4 to T6 level. That's where you find those. And in between, you find these sort of intermediate fence details, like a split rail fence that's sort of maybe at the edge of town. And then these sort of picket fences that are sort of in the middle of town. And then as the more urban you get, the harder the surfaces to get, the more the security really matters from sort of urban security standpoint. And so you find more refinement in the urban center and more rustic conditions at the edges. And why does this fence type at the top make more sense in a rural environment? And why wouldn't you want to put that kind of fence in the very center of the city? And I think it has to do with a lot of practical things. So, for example, if you had this fence at the top in the middle of the city, people might suddenly snag their coats and shirts while they're walking by, and you'd have this sort of obtrusive angle of a fence sort of sticking into your face. Similarly, this fence here at the top right, sort of zigzags through the landscape, and when you're in a countryside environment, that actually makes perfect sense. You got a lot of land to cover, you got a lot of space, and you can make that work. Whereas when you're in the middle of the city, you're trying to deal with more straight lines. People are really efficient with their properties because they have small properties. You have brick walls because you need more privacy. You have more strangers walking by. And so suddenly, like, the ability to see through the fence is a consideration that's different than when you're in the rural countryside where you have less people walking around. And so you have sort of appropriate fences for different ecologies, if you will, along this rural to urban transect. And for me, this kind of way of thinking about how fences are part of systems, are part of habitats, is evidence for design. For me, how individual components perfectly dovetail into their appropriate habitats is evidence for design. So when you go to beautiful cities, like this is a aerial view of part of Charleston, South Carolina. Usually this is regarded as one of the more beautiful urban environments in this country. And when you go through that city, it's very consistently coherent about how the individual parts relate to the whole. You have front facades, and then you have back of house gardens, and you have garbage that happens in hidden locations and storefronts and front entrances that happens in the front. And you have a certain relationship of the buildings to the street versus the backyards. And there's a consistent approach about how each element of each building relates to the whole, which is what makes it so pleasant and so coherent for people to experience this kind of environment. And so what we find, I think, is that you find that these kinds of system integration is in keeping with the way that Paul talks about the human body. And I'm just going to read this from 1 Corinthians 12. But God has put the body together, giving greater honor to the parts that lacked it, so that there should be no division in the body, but that its parts should have equal concern for each other. If one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. What he's describing here is that he's describing a set of interrelationships, of system integration, where every part of the body is related to the whole and related to each other in a very purposeful and intentional way. And the minute you start losing sight of that, your body actually starts to fail. Your body becomes sick. Your body becomes deformed. And in a similar way, architectural decisions that aren't part of a holistic systemic approach become aberrations, become things that don't function very well. They start to break down the overall wholeness of the environment that you find in our world. And so here's an example of that. This is a really famous example that is talked about often in architectural history. It is a famous tower that was built in the 1960s in the city of Paris in France. And, if you've ever been to Paris, you'll know that Paris is a very consistently designed city. It's a very holistic environment. There was a lot of effort put into making it such in the 19th century. The picture on the right-hand side shows you a very typical sidewalk street view in, in the city of Paris. You'll find this almost in any neighborhood in Paris, this kind of environment, and all the trees are in very specific locations, and the elevations and facades of the buildings have particular relationships to the streets. The roof lines with their mansard roofs are consistently set back. The dormer windows, all the elements of the sidewalk and public furnishings have been designed. You can see a kiosk here in the background and the bollards here on the left. All of that was designed by an army of designers that were thinking about holistic environment. And so the cityscape in Paris is extremely coherent in that way and very consistent. And it's only broken when you have very important buildings like churches and different public buildings that you see here that sort of stand out in that cityscape. And so when this tower was built in Paris in the 1960s, it was like a huge shock to the system. And what you find is that you suddenly have a building that isn't participating in the integrated system approach. It's not participating in the ecology in the usual way. It inserts itself in a completely different kind of way, and it causes a lot of consternation. The public in Paris was extremely disturbed by the sudden appearance of a completely different building type that had a totally different approach to the streets. And they banned all future high-rises in the city of Paris. And so the only place where you can find high-rises in Paris, if you've ever been there, is at the very edge of the city, because technically they are outside of the city limits of Paris. They're in suburbs at the very edges. The city of Paris has banned skyscrapers ever since this tower. And you might wonder, well, why? Why would you be so afraid of change? Isn't that sort of what architects do, is push the envelope? And certainly that's something architects have often been famous for. But what you find when you look at the Tour Montparnasse in Paris, look at what's happening also on the ground level. So when you have a tower like this that assumes that people arrive by car, suddenly you have a tremendous concentration of automobiles that come to the same location, because you have a skyscraper with a lot higher density, with a lot of people, office workers and people living in hotels. And so now suddenly you have a tremendous burden that's placed on public infrastructure around the building just for vehicles to arrive. And so that changes the whole approach for how that building relates to public space. And what you can see in this photograph in the middle is that you have a very sort of automobile-oriented public realm that happens around the base of this skyscraper that is completely different from the ecology that is designed to the right. And so people were shocked by this, what essentially you could refer to as a transect violation, where suddenly the ecological transect was not participated with. And what this really shows you is that wholeness requires willing participation. It requires intelligence. It requires people participating in a comprehensive approach where there is a certain set of relationships between individual components and the whole. And so I like to sort of remind ourselves of that wholeness from a spiritual perspective here at the end before we hand it over to Ryan. And that is this beautiful quote by Ellen White in Desire of Ages, page 555, where she says, "Holiness is wholeness for God. It is the entire surrender of heart and life to the indwelling of the principles of heaven." And so what she's really talking about is that every decision that you make, every aspect of your life is part of a systematic approach of surrendering to God and his will. That's the only way that wholeness is achieved. And if you refuse to surrender, if you make choices that are contrary to the system, so to speak, contrary to the whole picture, to the intent of creation, to those 6-day ecologies that we talked about in the book of Genesis, then you don't have wholeness, but you actually have sin. You have aberration, and you have destruction, and you have damage. And so I have this photograph here at the top from Tuscany. This is a beautiful valley in Tuscany that I get to take my students to every year, except during COVID. It's this, it's one of the most photographed valleys in the world. If you go to Olive Garden, it's on the menus and everything. And it's in Italy. And I think one of the reasons that people take pictures of it is because it looks like a completely integrated environment. It looks like all the individual components are participating in a holistic framework, including the individual houses, including the roads, including the plantings around the houses, including the agricultural fields, including the natural landscape in the distance. And so we know from design that system integration requires intelligence. And even in the word ecology itself is the implication that you're studying a house. And so where do houses come from? They come from a designer. And so I want to hand this over to Ryan to keep this going.